You know how sometimes life just feels too good? Like everything is in place, and you're almost afraid to breathe because you don't want to ruin it? That's how I felt about my marriage. Emily and I had been together for 7 years, married for 5. We had our ups and downs, sure, but nothing major. We had our routines. We had our laughs. And I thought we had trust. It started small, as these things usually do. Emily had always been a social butterfly. She loved being out, loved talking to people. That was one of the things that drew me to her. She made life seem brighter. But over the past few months, I noticed something different. She'd started mentioning a new guy she met at the supermarket. Tom, I think his name was. She'd laugh about how he always seemed to be there when she shopped, how friendly he was. At first, I didn't think much of it. People make connections in everyday life, right? But it was the little things that started gnawing at me. She'd come home from her shopping trips later and later, always with some story about how the lines were long or how she ran into someone she knew. I didn't press her, but then she started bringing him up more. Tom says they're running a deal on this, or Tom suggested I try this recipe. It was casual, sure, but when you've been with someone for as long as we had, you start to sense when things aren't adding up. One night, we were sitting on the couch, her phone buzzing every few minutes. I asked her who it was. She laughed it off, saying it was a group chat from work, nothing serious. I let it go, but something about the way she quickly turned her phone face down, how she kept glancing at it. My gut twisted in a way it hadn't before. I'm not proud of this, but I started checking her social media more. Her posts were the same. Pictures of us, selfies with friends, nothing alarming. But then I noticed something else. Her outfits were changing. Emily had always been stylish, but suddenly she was buying clothes that were different, more form-fitting, more revealing. I didn't want to believe anything was wrong, so I told myself she was just feeling good about herself. But the late-night shopping trips became more frequent, and the stories she'd tell me about the supermarket and Tom got more elaborate. It wasn't just a passing mention anymore. She'd tell me about his life, how funny he was, how they bumped into each other by chance again. It was like this guy had suddenly become a central character in our lives, without me even meeting him. Then came the night when everything shifted. It was a Saturday. We were supposed to have dinner together, just the two of us, but Emily got a message on her phone. She looked at it, and I could see her smile fade. She told me she needed to run to the store, that she'd forgotten to pick up something for dinner. I didn't argue. I just nodded, though something inside me said I should. 2 hours later, she still wasn't back. I called her, no answer. Texted, nothing. The knot in my stomach tightened. When she finally walked through the door, she looked flustered. I asked her if everything was okay, and she gave me the same excuse as always. The lines were crazy. But this time, I didn't believe her. This time, I noticed the faint trace of a smile she couldn't quite hide. And that was the night I first started to wonder if Emily wasn't just shopping at the supermarket. Maybe Tom wasn't just a friendly face in the aisles. Maybe he was something much worse. The days after that night were heavy with tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I didn't have anything concrete to go on, just a gut feeling, which wasn't enough to accuse her of anything. Emily, for her part, acted like nothing had changed. She was as affectionate as ever, though a bit more distant. It was subtle, but after being together for years, I could tell when her mind was elsewhere. One evening, about a week later, she told me she was going to the supermarket again. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I also couldn't ignore the gnawing suspicion anymore. I didn't say anything as she left, but as soon as she was out the door, I grabbed my jacket and decided to follow her. I'd never done anything like this before, but I had to know what was really going on. My heart was pounding the entire drive to the supermarket. When I got there, I parked a few rows back from where she'd left the car and waited. I watched as she walked inside. I knew this was crazy. I didn't even know what I was looking for. Maybe she really was just picking up groceries. But after about 15 minutes, she wasn't back yet. I kept watching, my mind racing with what-ifs. And then I saw him, Tom. He was walking out of the store, heading straight for Emily's car. My heart dropped when I saw him unlock the passenger side and get in. It was like a scene from a movie, happening in slow motion. I sat there, frozen, unsure of what to do. They weren't going anywhere, just sitting there, together. Were they talking? Laughing? Kissing? I couldn't tell from where I was. All I knew was that they were there, and it felt like my whole world was crumbling. I stayed in the car, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. Part of me wanted to storm over there, to confront them both. But another part of me, the more terrified, vulnerable part, was too scared of what I'd find out. I wasn't ready for the truth. Not yet. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Tom got out of the car. He casually waved at her before walking back into the store. A minute later, Emily emerged from the supermarket, carrying a single grocery bag. I couldn't believe it. She'd gone through the motions, pretending everything was normal, but I knew now that it wasn't. I drove home in silence, my thoughts spinning. When she walked through the door later that night, she smiled and gave me the same routine. Sorry I took so long. You know how crazy the store gets on a weekend. She even showed me the groceries as if that would convince me. But all I could think about was Tom, sitting in our car with her, like it was the most natural thing in the world. That was my first real clue, and it was only the beginning. After seeing Tom in the car with her, everything changed for me. Every moment felt heavier. Every word she said dripped with suspicion. But I still couldn't bring myself to confront her. Not yet. I needed more. More proof. More certainty. Maybe, deep down, I was hoping I was wrong, that I'd misread the situation. But how could I? I saw him in the car. I knew something was going on, but the coward in me wasn't ready to face it head-on. The next few days, I watched her carefully. Every little action felt magnified. Was she smiling at her phone a little too much? Was she making more of an effort to look good when she left for the store? I hated myself for thinking like this, for doubting her every move. This was Emily, the woman I loved, the woman I'd built a life with. But now, she felt like a stranger, someone who was capable of things I didn't want to believe. One night, after dinner, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, and I was at the kitchen table, pretending to go through some work emails. My heart was racing. I wanted to ask her, needed to ask her, what was really going on. But every time I opened my mouth, the words caught in my throat. What if she denied it? Worse, what if she didn't? Instead, I asked, "How was your day?" She looked up, a little surprised, like I hadn't spoken to her in days. "It was fine," she said, smiling lightly. "Work was busy, and I ran a few errands afterward." She paused, her eyes flickering over me for a second. "Why? Is everything okay?" It was such a normal question, but the weight of it almost crushed me. I wanted to scream that nothing was okay, that everything felt like it was falling apart, and I had no idea how to fix it. Instead, I just nodded. "Yeah, just checking in." She smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. And then, she went back to her phone. I stared at her for a while, trying to see through her, trying to figure out what was going on in her head. Was she thinking about Tom? Were they texting right now? I hated how paranoid I'd become, how every little thing seemed like evidence of something bigger. Later that night, when she went to bed, I stayed up. I needed time to think, to figure out my next move. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly second-guessing everything she said and did. I knew I had to confront her eventually, but I wasn't ready. Not without proof. Not without knowing exactly what I was dealing with. I poured myself a drink and sat in the silence of our living room, wondering how the hell I'd gotten here. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? And more importantly, what was I going to do about it? I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't pretend much longer that a week passed, and my mind kept spiraling. I was barely functioning at work, constantly distracted, replaying that night over and over. Tom, in the car. Emily, smiling like nothing had happened. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. But I still hadn't confronted her. Instead, I was watching, waiting, hoping for some kind of slip-up that would give me the truth I needed to hear. Then it happened. Her mistake. It was a Saturday morning, and Emily had just left for her usual trip to the supermarket. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee, trying to calm my nerves. She was supposed to be back in an hour or so, and as usual, I planned to stay behind, wondering if Tom would be there. But that day, I wasn't alone with my thoughts for long. Her phone buzzed on the counter. At first, I tried to ignore it. I'd never been the type to snoop, and I didn't want to cross that line. But the sound kept nagging at me, louder with each buzz. My hands started shaking. I glanced at the screen, and it lit up with a notification, a message. From Tom. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that one step forward would change everything. My better judgment screamed at me to leave it alone, to respect her privacy. But another part of me, the part that had seen him in our car, couldn't resist. I needed to know. I picked up the phone, my hands trembling. The message preview read, "Can't wait to see you later, face blowing a kiss." That was it. That's all I needed to see. My whole body went cold, my stomach twisting into knots. I quickly unlocked her phone. She'd given me the passcode months ago, back when trust wasn't something I ever questioned. Scrolling through the conversation, it was worse than I'd imagined. Flirty messages, inside jokes, and plans to meet up, more than just at the supermarket. Some of the messages were playful, others were intimate. My heart sank as I realized that this wasn't just an innocent friendship. This was an affair, plain and simple. I dropped the phone like it was burning my hands, pacing around the kitchen, trying to make sense of it all. How long had this been going on? How could I have missed it? I felt sick, like the ground had disappeared from beneath me. This wasn't just my imagination running wild anymore. This was real. She was cheating. I sat down, my mind spinning. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Part of me wanted to call her right then and scream at her, tell her I knew everything. But another part of me, the part that was still in shock, told me to wait. I needed to process this. I needed to figure out what to do next. When she got home, smiling like she always did, I couldn't even look at her. I just nodded, numb, as she placed the groceries on the counter and kissed me on the cheek. The worst part? She had no idea I knew. The rest of that day was a blur. Emily acted like everything was fine, like nothing had changed. But for me, it was like the world had shifted beneath my feet. I tried to go through the motions, helping her put away the groceries, making small talk. But inside, I was screaming. Every time she smiled, every time she touched me, it felt like a lie. I couldn't help but imagine her with him, Tom, sharing the same kind of moments she used to share with me. The weight of it was unbearable, but I still wasn't ready to confront her. I stayed quiet, my mind racing through all the possible scenarios. What would she say when I finally called her out? Would she deny it? Try to gaslight me into thinking I was being paranoid? Or would she admit everything, leaving me to deal with the fallout of her betrayal? I wasn't sure which option terrified me more. That night, I barely slept. I lay next to her in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the distance between us like a physical wall. She had no idea that I knew. She didn't know that I had seen her messages, that I was now carrying the weight of this secret with me. The worst part was how normal she acted, like we were still the same couple we'd always been. But I knew the truth now. There was no going back from this. The next few days were torture. I couldn't focus at work, and every time I saw her, I felt my anger bubbling just beneath the surface. I wanted to explode, to demand answers, but I didn't. I kept waiting, trying to figure out when the right time would be. I needed to catch her in the act, to confront her with undeniable proof so she couldn't wiggle out of it. But waiting was killing me. One evening, we were having dinner together, and she mentioned Tom again, casually, like he was just a friendly acquaintance. My stomach churned, but I forced a smile, pretending like everything was fine. The hypocrisy of it all was suffocating. Here she was, talking about him like it was no big deal, while they were clearly planning to meet behind my back. How could she do this? How could she sit there, eating dinner with me, while carrying on an affair with someone else? I excused myself from the table and went into the bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. Who was I becoming? A man too afraid to face the truth head-on? A man who let his wife's lies continue, unchecked? I splashed water on my face, trying to calm the rage building inside me. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep living like this. The longer I stayed silent, the more it was eating away at me. I walked back into the dining room, my heart pounding, ready to say something, anything. But when I saw her sitting there, smiling at me, I hesitated. Not yet. Not tonight. I needed more time. But time was running out. That night, after she went to bed, I stayed up late again. This had become a pattern. I couldn't sleep, couldn't shut off my mind. I needed a plan. It wasn't enough to suspect her anymore. I needed hard proof, something undeniable that I could confront her with. I opened her phone again. I knew it was wrong. I knew that snooping wasn't something I ever wanted to do in a relationship, but this wasn't just a relationship anymore. This was survival. I needed to protect myself from the lies she was telling me every single day. The messages were still there. She hadn't even bothered to delete them. I scrolled back through her conversation with Tom, reading every word, every flirtatious comment, every plan they made to meet. It felt like I was being punched in the gut over and over again. They'd met at least 5 times outside of the supermarket, at his place, at a hotel, even once at our home while I was away on a work trip. I wanted to be sick, but it wasn't just the physical betrayal that hurt. It was the emotional intimacy between them. She shared things with him that she hadn't shared with me in months. Jokes, personal stories, things she used to tell me. They even had pet names for each other. It was like I was watching my own marriage dissolve in real time. I took screenshots of everything. I wasn't going to let her talk her way out of this when the time came. I needed her to see, to know that I wasn't some fool who could be played. I needed her to understand the depth of the hurt she'd caused. But as I sat there, staring at the evidence, I realized something else. Even with all of this proof, I didn't know what I would do next. Confronting her was one thing, but what came after that? Could I forgive her? Did I even want to? Or was this the end? The thought of leaving her, of ending our marriage, terrified me. But the thought of staying with someone who could lie to my face like this, that scared me even more. The following week felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I was on autopilot, going through the motions of daily life, but everything was overshadowed by the weight of what I knew. Emily continued to act like nothing was wrong, completely unaware that I had uncovered her secret. Each time she smiled at me, each time she touched me, it felt like another betrayal. One night, after yet another grocery run, she came home with that same fake cheerfulness. I couldn't take it anymore. I was unraveling, and the tension between us was suffocating. I didn't want to be near her, didn't want to hear her voice. So I did what I'd been avoiding for weeks. I told her I needed space. She looked confused, hurt even, but she didn't push me on it. Instead, she gave me this sad smile and said, "If you need some time to yourself, I understand." The irony of it almost made me laugh. She was the one betraying me, and yet here she was, acting like I was the one who needed time to reflect. That night, I slept in the guest room. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was the first real separation we'd had in years. And as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I realized I couldn't avoid it any longer. The confrontation had to happen. I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. I had the proof, and now I needed to use it. The next day, I couldn't take it anymore. I had the screenshots, the messages, and most of all, the anger bubbling up inside me. It was time. I waited until the evening when we were both home, sitting on opposite ends of the living room. The tension had been thick all day, and she could sense that something was off. "Emily," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." She looked up from her phone, a hint of confusion in her eyes. "About what?" she asked, her tone casual, but I could hear the nervous edge in her voice. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I know about you and Tom." Her face went pale, and for a moment, she just stared at me, wide-eyed. Then, she started to speak, her voice trembling. "What are you talking about? Tom's just a friend. We—" "Don't lie to me," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the screenshots until I found what I needed. I held it up to her, the evidence staring her in the face. She didn't say anything at first. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at the messages, her lip quivering. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely audible. My heart shattered. The words I'd been dreading had finally been spoken, and they hit me like a freight train. I had prepared for this moment for weeks, but nothing could have prepared me for the pain of hearing her admit it. The air between us was thick with silence. Emily sat across from me, her head in her hands, tears streaming down her face. I felt numb, like I was watching the whole thing from outside my body. This was the woman I'd loved, the woman I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, and now everything we'd built felt like a lie. I never meant for this to happen, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It got out of hand. Out of hand. I echoed, my voice rising. You've been seeing him for months, Emily. You lied to me every day, every time you walked through that door. How long were you planning to keep this up? She flinched at my words, but I didn't care. I was past caring. All the anger, all the hurt, it was boiling over now, and there was no stopping it. I don't know, she sobbed. I don't know. It just happened. I was unhappy, and I didn't know how to tell you. And then Tom. Tom, I spat the name, my stomach twisting in disgust. What about him? Does he know you're sitting here, crying over your marriage? Or is he just waiting for you to show up again? She shook her head, her face crumpling. It's over with him. I ended it. I don't want him. I want us. The words hung in the air between us, but they didn't bring the comfort she seemed to think they would. I stared at her, searching for any sign of the woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted. But all I could see was someone who had betrayed me. I don't know if there's an us anymore, I said quietly. The days following the confrontation were a blur. We barely spoke. When we did, it was short, clipped exchanges, about dinner, about work, about anything except the elephant in the room. She was desperate to fix things, but I wasn't ready to even think about reconciliation. How could I trust her again? How could I look at her the same way, knowing what she'd done? She apologized constantly. I'd come home from work to find her in tears, begging me to give her another chance. I'll do anything, she'd say. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. But I was still in shock. I felt like I was living in a fog, like nothing was real anymore. The life we had, the future I thought we'd share. It had all been ripped away, and I didn't know how to piece it back together. One night, she suggested we go out for dinner, try to talk things through in a neutral space. I agreed, mostly because I didn't know what else to do. We sat in a quiet restaurant, the candlelight flickering between us, and she poured her heart out. She told me how lonely she'd felt, how she thought I wasn't paying attention to her anymore, how Tom had made her feel seen. I'm not excusing it, she said, her voice shaking. I know I messed up, but I need you to know why it happened. It wasn't because I didn't love you. It was because I didn't know how to reach you anymore. Her words hit me hard. I knew there was truth in what she was saying. I hadn't been the perfect husband. I'd been distant, distracted, caught up in work and life, and I hadn't seen the signs of her unhappiness. But did that justify what she did? Did that excuse the lies, the betrayal? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I was drowning in a sea of emotions I didn't know how to navigate. Weeks passed, and the tension between us became unbearable. We were stuck in this limbo, neither moving forward nor backward, just existing. Emily was trying. I could see that. She'd cut off all contact with Tom, started seeing a therapist, and kept pushing for us to go to couples counseling. But I was still struggling to figure out what I wanted. One night, after another round of half-hearted attempts at conversation, I realized something. I couldn't live like this anymore. Whether we stayed together or not, something had to change. This in-between state was killing both of us. I told her I needed space. Real space. Not just a few nights on the couch, but time apart to figure things out. She didn't take it well. She begged me not to go, said that if I left, it would be the end. But I knew it was the only way I could clear my head. So, I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend for a while. It wasn't easy, but it felt like the right decision. I needed distance from her, from the house, from the memories. I needed to breathe. In the quiet of those days away, I finally had time to think. I replayed everything over and over. Our relationship, her affair, the confrontation. I asked myself the hard questions. Could I forgive her? Could I trust her again? And even if I could, did I want to? The truth was, I didn't know. But I did know that I couldn't make that decision while living under the same roof, surrounded by the ghosts of our marriage. Eventually, I agreed to couples counseling. It was Emily's suggestion, and though I was reluctant, I knew we couldn't keep going like this. If there was any hope of salvaging our relationship, we needed help. So, We found a therapist and started the sessions. The first few sessions were brutal. We sat in that small room, facing each other, with the therapist guiding us through conversations we'd avoided for months. Emily was vulnerable, tearful, admitting to all the ways she felt I'd abandoned her emotionally. I, on the other hand, was angry that she had turned to someone else instead of talking to me. "It wasn't about replacing you," she said one day. "I wasn't trying to find another you. I was just trying to feel something." The words stung, but there was truth in them. I knew I hadn't been the most attentive husband. Life had gotten busy, stressful, and I had taken her for granted. But still, her actions, how could I ever get past them? The therapist helped us dig deep, uncovering wounds we hadn't realized were there. We talked about the affair, yes, but we also talked about the cracks that had formed long before Tom entered the picture. The sessions were exhausting, emotionally draining, but slowly, I started to see the value in them. We were communicating again, really talking, for the first time in what felt like years. But still, there was no guarantee. I didn't know if therapy would be enough. I didn't know if I would ever be able to look at her without seeing the betrayal. One night, after a particularly intense therapy session, Emily and I sat in the car, not saying a word. The weight of everything hung between us, thick and suffocating. I turned to her, watching as she wiped her eyes, exhausted from crying. "I don't know if this will work," I said, my voice raw with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." She nodded, sniffling. "I know. I understand if you can't. I just want you to know that I'm not giving up on us. Not yet." Her words lingered in the air, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with. She wasn't perfect, far from it, but neither was I. We had both made mistakes, some bigger than others. But as I sat there, looking at her, I realized that maybe, just maybe, there was something still worth fighting for. It wasn't a grand epiphany. I didn't suddenly feel ready to forgive her or forget what had happened. But in that moment, I saw a glimpse of hope, and that was enough to keep trying. The road to recovery wasn't easy. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. Every time Emily's phone buzzed, I felt a pang of anxiety. Every time she left the house, I wondered if she was really where she said she'd be. It was exhausting, this constant state of vigilance. But little by little, we started to rebuild. She gave me full access to her phone, her email, everything. Not because I asked, but because she wanted to show me that she was committed to earning my trust back. It felt invasive, having to monitor her like that, but it was the only way I could begin to feel safe again. We kept going to therapy, working through the layers of hurt and betrayal. Some days were better than others. Some days, I felt like we were making real progress, like we might actually come out the other side stronger. Other days, I felt like I was drowning in the pain all over again, and I wasn't sure I could keep doing this. But Emily didn't give up. She fought for us, harder than I ever expected her to. And slowly, I began to realize that maybe I wasn't ready to give up either. Months passed, and though the scars of her betrayal would always be there, they started to fade. We were different now. Our marriage wasn't the same as it had been before the affair. But maybe that was a good thing. Maybe we had needed to break to rebuild something stronger, something more honest. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the pain resurfaced and threatened to pull us under. But we were working through it together. One evening, we sat on the porch, watching the sunset, the quiet settling around us like a blanket. Emily reached over, taking my hand in hers. For the first time in months, the touch didn't feel forced or uncomfortable. It felt real. "We've been through a lot," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "But I still believe in us." I looked at her, the woman I had chosen all those years ago, the woman who had hurt me more deeply than I ever thought possible. And yet, here we were, still standing. "I do too," I said, squeezing her hand. It wasn't a promise that everything would be perfect, but it was a start, a new beginning. And for now, that was enough.